On November 7th, 1956, at 2 a.m. Cairo time, the ceasefire along the Suez Canal goes into effect. The fighting may be over, but the crisis isn't. British, French, and Israeli troops still occupy significant swaths of Egyptian territory. The canal itself remains blocked, and all sides are going to take some persuading to accept the UN peacekeepers. But what has it all meant? How does the world look after the dust settles? Welcome to a TimeGhost chronological documentary series on the Suez Crisis. I'm Indy Neidell. Last time, we saw that the Anglo-French invasion was over almost as soon as it had begun. Paratroopers landed in and around Port Said at dawn on November 5th, and Royal Marines came ashore the following day. But the British government realized that the economic and political damage was too high from the start and accepted the UN ceasefire. France reluctantly agreed. And with the hostilities at an end, diplomats at the UN worked to get the United Nations emergency force to the region as quickly as possible. It is formally established on November 7th by a UN General Assembly resolution, with Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld to head an advisory committee on its structure. Another resolution submitted by an Afro-Asian bloc is also passed that same day and calls on Britain, France, and Israel to immediately withdraw from the conflict zone. There are still some issues that need to be hammered out, though. The main obstacle is getting Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser to agree to a multinational force patrolling Egyptian territory. He is especially hostile to Canada contributing troops, because not only is it a NATO country, but also a Commonwealth one, and Nasser does not like the idea of such a close ally of Britain's patrolling his territory. Eventually, however, and thanks to the insistence of Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Nasser concedes. The first peacekeeping troops enter Egypt November 15th. Canada and India make the most significant contribution, but soldiers from all of the Nordic nations, as well as Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia, also send troops. The emergency session of the General Assembly has done its job and can dissolve. The Suez crisis at the UN is over. But it's not over for Britain and France, who are not ready to leave Egypt just yet. Collectively, their forces occupy Port Said, Port Fouad, and a short strip of the canal itself to the south of these settlements. This they hope to use as a bargaining chip in future negotiations. In fact, when British Prime Minister Anthony Eden announces the ceasefire in the House of Commons on the evening of the 6th, he says that British and French forces will remain to clear the canal of obstructions. But American President Dwight Eisenhower is firmly against this and determined not to provide Britain any financial assistance until he sees a full withdrawal. This is pretty bad for the British government. For one, the oil crisis is becoming more and more acute. November 7th is when the reduced oil deliveries because of the closure of the Suez Canal start arriving. Officials in Eisenhower's administration predict that even with full American support, all of Europe will face a deficit of around 10 to 15% of its oil requirements. Later this month, the British government will announce serious fuel rationing measures beginning in December. They will not be lifted until May 1957. The financial situation is even more desperate, though. The Bank of England is draining its currency reserves to stop the pound from plummeting in value. On December 3rd, Chancellor of the Exchequer Harold Macmillan is scheduled to publicly announce the November figures for these reserves in the House of Commons. If they are too low, it will bring the pound down even more and be a political and economic disaster. So as November unfolds and the December deadline gets closer, there is a flurry of diplomatic dealings and failed schemes to ensure some guarantee of American support. Eden is determined to stay in Suez and maintain some illusion of a peacekeeping victory. Unfortunately for him, but maybe fortunately for the rest of the country, his health soon collapses completely. He has been struggling with a gallbladder condition for some time now and is utterly exhausted. His doctors strongly advise him to rest, which he does. In late November, he departs for Jamaica to relax at the home of Ian Fleming. Yep, Ian Fleming. Macmillan is now mainly in charge, and he is much more flexible than his ailing prime minister. On the other side, Eisenhower is ready to make some concessions. Finally, on December 3rd, the government pushes the chancellor's announcement back to December 4th to buy time. The Americans and British have a deal. So long as the British promise that they will withdraw as soon as possible, they don't have to announce a specific timetable for when. It means that when Macmillan makes his announcement, he can soften it with the news of the massive assistance America will provide. And massive it is. A huge IMF loan is granted, as well as a new agreement that Britain has the unconditional right to defer debt repayments a total of 7 times on post-war American loans made to them. British finances are looking a lot more secure. The last Anglo-French troops leave Egypt before Christmas. Not long after the new year, Eden retires in disgrace, and Macmillan is the new prime minister. It's trickier, though, to get Israel's military, the IDF, out of Egyptian territory. On November 7th, Israel officially accepts the UN ceasefire. But that same day, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion delivers a speech to the Knesset, Israel's legislative body. The glorious military operation, which lasted a week and conquered the entire Sinai Peninsula of 60,000 square kilometers, is an unprecedented feat in Jewish history and is rare in the world's history. Our forces did not attack Egypt proper, and I hope the Egyptian dictator will not compel Israelis to violate the biblical injunction never to return to that country. The armistice with Egypt is dead, as are the armistice lines, and no wizards or magicians can resurrect these lines which cloaked Egyptian murders and sabotage. See how Ben-Gurion doesn't accept that the peninsula is part of sovereign Egyptian territory? In fact, he's making pretty strong suggestions that the IDF will stay there. It sounds a lot like he wants to annex the region as a permanent buffer zone between Egypt and Israel, but that is a tough battle. After he has made his speech, he faces a furious reaction from America. Under-Secretary of State Herbert Hoover Jr. tells the Israeli ambassador in Washington that his country is endangering world peace and risking sanctions. And Eisenhower cables Ben-Gurion directly, telling him he must withdraw his forces immediately. Ben-Gurion takes a more conciliatory tone with Eisenhower. He returns the cable November 8th, saying that Israel has no plans to annex Sinai and will withdraw as soon as satisfactory arrangements are made with the UN. And in early December, Israeli forces do start leaving areas of the Canal Zone. But Ben-Gurion refuses a full withdrawal until Israel has at least received assurances that Egypt will not return to the Gaza Strip or block the Straits of Tiran. A diplomatic deadlock continues well into the new year. On February 5th, 1957, American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles tells a press conference that America would support the UN in applying sanctions on Israel if it does not withdraw. But this is controversial, and the administration faces harsh criticism both in Congress and from the press. Finally, the impasse is broken on February 11th when Dulles informs Israeli diplomats that America will recognize the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of which they are part as an international waterway, and support the stationing of UN troops in Gaza. The rest of February sees some more toing and froing, and things will almost fall apart again several times. But eventually, Ben-Gurion gets the Americans to guarantee freedom of navigation in the Straits of Tiran and a demilitarized non-Egyptian Gaza. And so finally, on March 1st, 1957, Israel announces their full withdrawal. Unfortunately for them, Hammarskjöld and UN delegates of the Afro-Asian bloc are actually against the non-Egyptian Gaza part. That is right. They will refuse to oppose the Egyptian government returning to Gaza. Nevertheless, Israel has won its most important objective of free Straits of Tiran. The United Nations Emergency Force takes up its new positions and begins patrolling the borders. So that was the Suez Crisis. It's over now, more or less. It has been a relatively limited and short conflict. Israel lost 189 soldiers, Britain 16, and France 10. We have no precise figures for Egyptian losses, but we know they are many times that. At least 1,650 soldiers are dead, and so are a minimum of 1,000 civilians. The canal itself will officially reopen April 10, 1957. By the summer, British and French ships move freely along it, provided they pay the traffic fee to the Egyptians, of course. But what does all this mean? What are the long-term effects? Well, it would take literally months to go into everything, but we can briefly sketch out how the crisis changed each of the belligerent countries. We'll start with the winners, and one of them might sort of surprise you. It's Egypt. Okay, it's more like President Nasser is a winner than Egypt itself. Despite his military definitely losing in the field, he has successfully defied the tripartite aggression from two old European colonial powers and his Middle Eastern enemy. It marks him as the preeminent leader of the Arab world, which is what he wanted, and cements Pan-Arabism as the dominant ideology in the Middle East. His defiance will inspire further revolutions and anti-colonial sentiment across the region, all based on the rhetoric he emphasizes of Arab unity. This will be taken further in 1958 when Egypt and Syria formally unite into the United Arab Republic under Nasser's leadership, though Syria will leave in 1961. The fervor he has inspired will last until the Six-Day War in 1967, which is also when he kicks the UN peacekeepers off of Egyptian land. The Arab defeat in that war, however, and then another in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, contribute to a decline in pan-Arab sentiment and the steady growth of Islamism as the defining ideology in the Middle East. The second winner here is Israel. Not only was Operation Kadesh a military success, completing all of its objectives, but Israel's world position is now assured. Israel is not even a decade old, and so far has led a very precarious existence. Terrorist raids from Gaza, financial worries, and closed trade routes all challenged its future. The undeniable victory in Sinai marks it as a strong nation able to defend itself from attack. It gives it a decade of secure borders and relative peace, allowing it to focus on domestic matters. The strategy the IDF employed will also shape its doctrine and prove successful again in later wars. Preemptive strikes and rapid movement will be the watchwords of Israeli military all the way into the 21st century. But a decidedly negative outcome for Israel is in its relations with the Arab world. As I just said, Pan-Arabism is now on the rise, and Israel's collusion with Britain and France is a significant factor in this, apparently confirming the most extreme Arab theories about the Jewish state, that it is a creation of European imperialism designed to be used against Arabs. In 1958, Nasser will endorse the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the infamous hoax from the early 20th century that proved Jews seek to dominate the world. And please don't write about it in the comments. It was a complete fabrication. Similar anti-Semitic pronouncements will be made all the way up to 1967 when the Middle East again descends into armed conflict. So that's the two winners. And it's pretty apparent who the losers are here: France and Britain. The loss of their great power status has been brought painfully home, and it's clear that neither can act independently of world opinion, especially of the two ascendant superpowers, the United States and the USSR. In France, this contributes to two major foreign policy directions. One is European integration. When Guy Mollet was forced to accept the ceasefire November 6, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer is reported to have told him, "Europe will be your revenge." And in many ways, it is. Let down by his Atlantic partners in Britain and America, Mollet will increasingly lead France towards deeper European integration. In less than a year, the European Economic Community will be established by the Treaty of Rome. Successive French leaders will turn away from Britain and America even more and commit France deeply to the European project. The second foreign policy direction is an independent nuclear option. This was already in the works and will get its finishing touches when Charles de Gaulle rises to power in 1958. Still, Suez is a significant moment in convincing French politicians that they need a nuclear option if they don't want to surrender their defense policy to NATO. In tandem with its increasing continental orientation, this will be done with European partners and, funnily enough, with Israel. One negative impact France largely escaped in the whole affair was domestic trauma. Sure, historians will look back at Suez and identify it as a source of moments like the Algiers Putsch in 1958, the civil unrest of May 1968, and even events beyond this. But the fact is that opinion polls and subsequent elections show that the French public does not disapprove of the operation as a whole. Suez will largely get lost in the French public mind as the Algerian War becomes ever bloodier and more divisive. The same is not true in Britain, where the crisis led to bitter debate, mass protests, and political embarrassment. And it is there where Suez will go down in history as the moment Britain stopped being a real colonial power. Not long before, the might of the British Empire had still seemed like a fact of life. Elizabeth II had been crowned with imperial fanfare in 1953, and imperial culture was everywhere, from children's books to consumer goods to national exhibitions. Suez did not change all of this overnight, but it accelerated the process of decolonization. In 1960, Prime Minister Macmillan declares to the South African Parliament that the wind of change is blowing through Africa, heralding a wave of decolonization that sweeps the continent in the early 1960s and soon leaves Britain with little left there to boast about. In 1965, probably the last real demonstration of British imperialism takes place, the state funeral of Winston Churchill. His procession passes solemnly through the streets of London with the high imperial fanfare of gun salutes, thronging crowds, and mourners from across the world. But when Churchill is put in the ground, it looks like the empire is too. The same year, the Beatles are honored as members of the Order of the British Empire, and really, only the most reactionary and backwards colonial fogies are angry that a long-haired pop band has received this highest honor. The British Empire is a thing of the past. If you'd like to learn about another place and time where anti-Semitic rhetoric went mainstream, then watch our Between Two Wars episode on Kristallnacht right here. Thank you to everyone for watching this series on the Suez Crisis. There are plenty more where this came from, and if you want to be part of that effort that keeps us going, then join the TimeGhost Army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. See you soon.